So I want to ask a question of everybody as it pertains to Magic Johnson, D.L. Hughley, Steve Harvey, Ricky Smiley, Michael Eric Dyson, pretty much all of these black celebrities that are going on these tangents and pretty much lecturing black people for not voting Democrat or not voting for Kamala Harris. And let's be honest, that's not even about Kamala Harris as much as it's about the Democratic Party, because they did the same thing almost 4 years ago with Joe Biden. Every 4 years, black people get a lecture about voting Democrat. And not just a lecture. We're talking shaming tactics. We're talking peer pressure. Some will go so far as to question your blackness because you don't want to vote Democrat. That's why when Joe Biden said what he said, I wasn't shocked, because it's the sentiment of black people. It's the sentiment of black people, which is, if you don't know whether you want to vote for me or Donald Trump, then you ain't black. That's the sentiment. The sentiment is that if you are a black person, you are supposed to vote Democrat, which is one of the most condescending, annoying, patronizing things that you can do to a black person. And while I said, AM, I didn't realize the macro impact of immigrants in the U.S. until I noticed they always plant them in black America. 30 years, Mexicans couldn't finish. Now the rest of the world's turn. I'm voting on policy. So, due to this behavior that I keep noticing, because let's be real, it's gotten to the point where this is basically coercion and intimidation, but it's coming from your own people. It's coming from your own people, which is why I'm asking this question. And the question is simple. Have black celebrities become the new red shirts? Now, some of you may have seen my YouTube short that I did earlier where I was breaking down what red shirts were. How many of you know what red shirts were? How many of you know what red shirts were? Press a 1 in the chat if you know what red shirts are or were. Shout out to Diana, said, we have always been conservative. Our parents really fell for the okie doke. Now we half enlightened, half monkey see, monkey do. Yeah. So for those of you that don't know what the red shirts were, see, most people hear about the Voters' Rights Act of 1965. And guess what? Guess what? You may not realize this, but there are black people that think we didn't get the right to vote until 1965. Do y'all realize that? Shout out to Caesar. He said, appreciate you, bro. Do y'all realize that? Do y'all realize that there are black people that think we didn't get the right to vote until 1965? See, the truth of the matter is, right? Truth of the matter is, Charles said in Florida they want 15-year-olds' rights to delete people. So the reality is, black people had the right to vote long before that. The only problem was there were things that were being done to either suppress black voters or disqualify black voters or coerce and intimidate black voters. So they had what was called, I think, the black codes or something like that. I'm not sure. So basically, they would do ridiculous things like give you a test. You know, if you were black, they would give you some sort of test. And if you didn't pass the test, you couldn't vote. Or they would have a jar of jelly beans and they would ask you how many jelly beans was in it. And if you couldn't guess how many jelly beans was in it, you weren't allowed to vote, right? Stupid shit like that, right? JLJ504HD said, when our ancestors marched and fought to have us to participate in voting process, they still think that we fought to vote Democrat only. Shaking my damn head. Yeah. And the crazy thing about it is when black folks were fighting for the right to vote back in the day, they were fighting for the right to vote Republican. That's what's so funny about it. That is what's so hilarious about it. That's what's so hilarious about it. The vast majority of black people going into Reconstruction were Republicans. Why were they Republicans? Because that was the party of Lincoln. You know, the president that signed the Emancipation Proclamation, not to mention the fact that there were numerous Republicans after Lincoln that tried to do numerous things for black people. In fact, the only headway that you've made in this country is from Republicans. And Democrats fought it every step of the way. Now, for those of you that don't know what a red shirt was, well, back in 1876, South Carolina, red shirts battle plan. The red shirts were a Democratic Party paramilitary group, also emerged. Democratic Party paramilitary groups also emerged in South Carolina during the 1876 state and national campaigns. There, members of these groups called themselves the Red Shirts. Their official battle plan, which called for Democratic clubs armed with rifles and pistols, stated in part, every Democrat must feel honor-bound to control the vote of at least one Negro by intimidation, purchase, keeping him away. Right? So each one of the members of the red shirt needed to intimidate at least one Negro or purchase their vote or just keep them away from the voting precincts. It said, we must attend every radical meeting. Democrats must go in as large numbers as they can and well armed behave at first with great courtesy, and as soon as their speakers begin, tell them that they are liars and are only trying to mislead the ignorant Negroes. I'm going to read that again. We must attend every radical meeting. Because keep in mind, at the time, they viewed the Republicans or the conservatives as radicals because what they were doing was drastically changing the way America was as it pertained to Negroes. So back then, the Democrats viewed it as radical. We must attend every radical meeting. Democrats must go in as large numbers as they can and well armed, behave at first with great courtesy, and as soon as their speakers begin, tell them that they are liars and are only trying to mislead the ignorant Negroes. In speeches to Negroes, you must remember that they can only be influenced by their fears, superstitions, and cupidity. Treat them so as to show them you are the superior race and that their natural position is that of subordination to the white man. Never threaten a man individually if he deserves to be threatened. The necessities of the times require that he should die. A dead radical is very harmless. A threatened radical is often troublesome, sometimes dangerous, and always vindictive. Every club must be uniformed in a red shirt, and they must be sure to wear it upon all public meetings, and particularly on the day of election. Now, these black celebrities, some of you might say, well, okay, Angryman, we get the correlation you're making between them, but they're not the same. Oh, really? They're not. Isn't it black celebrities that are telling you that the Republicans are liars and they're only trying to mislead you as if you're ignorant Negroes that don't know any better? As far as the part where they're saying something about somebody losing their life, was it not Sean P. Diddy Combs that started the organization Citizen Change in 2004, whose motto was vote or die? Hot Rod Williams said most Republicans are liars. You see what I mean? He's doing exactly what I just got through describing. We must attend every radical meeting. Democrats must go in as large numbers as they can and well armed, behave at first with great courtesy, and as soon as their speakers begin to tell them tell them that they are liars and trying to mislead the ignorant Negroes. Exactly. He literally did what I just described. literally did what I just described. Literally. See, they don't have non-black people say those things to you. See, now what they do is they basically take black faces and have them say it. They are literally spewing the same rhetoric as the red shirts. They are literally trying to either coerce or intimidate you into voting Democrat. You know who's never tried to coerce you? You know who's never tried to intimidate you? This is the reason why that statement that Dingleberry just put up there doesn't even matter. It's irrelevant. Saying that the Republicans are liars is irrelevant. You know why? Because Republicans are not going to try to coerce you into voting for them. They're not going to intimidate you into voting for them. But see, black folk in America are so ass backwards, so messed up by the history of what black people have went through in this country that you don't even know who your enemy or your ally is. You don't know. You have no frame of reference. This goes back to what I said about not vibrating at a higher frequency. Saying that Republicans are liars is a pointless thing to say because all politicians are liars. All humans are liars. Nobody gives a shit about you being a liar. What we give a damn about is results. That's what we care about. Results. The only time I care about a lie when it comes to a politician is if they say they're going to do something and then they don't do it. That's the only time I care about a lie with a politician. So when you look at black people, this is what they do. Republicans don't pander for your vote. So guess how you perceive that? They don't care about us. The Democrats pander for your vote. Guess how you perceive that? They must care about us. But why am I surprised? As a black man that comes to the internet and started out my career on YouTube telling black women things that are for their own good and being told that I hate them, I'm not surprised. Because black people will despise people that give you the harsh truth that will actually benefit you. but you love the people that lie to you to keep you in a state of debauchery. See, the thing that you are interpreting as hate from the Republican Party is really indifference. It's really indifference. It's not hate, it's indifference. You know how they view it? They view it like this: if you're stupid enough to vote for the Democrats, be my guest. Because the mentality of a conservative is you get what you deserve. See, the Republicans today are not trying to be your saviors because they already did that. They already did that. And in spite of them doing that, you turned your back on them in the damn 60s because LBJ gave you free shit. So what you perceive as hate from the Republican Party is really just indifference. And what you perceive as love from the Democratic Party is really ownership and control. See, back in the day, the slave thought that his slave master loved him because he gave him a shelter, he gave him food. And what a surprise. What did LBJ give you to get you to stop voting Democrat? Let's see. Section 8, that's shelter. Public housing, that's shelter. Food stamps, that's food. You got black folk that will come to my channel and they'll say, we're not free, angry man. We're still slaves. Yeah, because you choose to be, dummy. You are basically the slave that is on the plantation that's thinking to yourself, I don't want to leave the plantation because that's the unknown. I don't know if I'll be able to take care of myself. I don't know if I'll be able to have a home. I don't know if I'll be able to get work. So I'll just stay here on the plantation because at least I'm getting fed and at least I got a roof over my head. Because the Republicans are not going to take care of you. They expect you to take care of yourself. Shout out to Seeker of Truth said Kamala is black. She has a pic of her eating greens and she has a bottle of hot sauce. Darius Drum said keep striving to the top, AM. Shout out to Diana said, "We the people hold the power. Y'all gave it away." Facts. In fact, I didn't find any success. I didn't find any success in life until I stopped blaming other groups of people for my problems and stopped expecting free shit. That's when my life got better. That's when my life got better. My life got better when I stopped blaming everyone else except me for my problems and stopped expecting free shit. That's when my life got better. Shout out to Latricia. Said hardcore knowledge this morning. Love it. Appreciate you.
$50 boss up. Stack up and match up.
The way Magic Johnson stood up there on that podium and said what he said, right? The way he stood up there.
Now, there's a lot of black men in here, and I don't mean to, not talk to other people, but this is important. Our black men, we got to get them out to vote. That's number one.
That's number one. That is the number one priority. He just didn't say the quiet part out loud. What he really wants to say is we got to make sure that these black men get out here and vote for these Democrats. Because, see, that's the misnomer. A lot of people sit back and they look at the black codes and they look at all of that was going on during Reconstruction and they say, oh, well, they didn't want us to vote. No, it wasn't that they didn't want you to vote. They didn't want you to vote for a Republican. See, the reason why they were trying to stop black people from voting back then is because most black people voted Republican. That's the nuance that you Negroes don't understand. Once black folk were set free through the Emancipation Proclamation and you started seeing black folk out there, once you get to the freaking 1800s and you start seeing black people voting, the reason why they were doing what they were doing in the Jim Crow South, because that's where Jim Crow came from. What emerged into Jim Crow, see, the red shirts and the white shirts and all of these little organizations, this is what ended up becoming the Ku Klux Klan. All of that was created for the purpose of voter intimidation. That's where it started. See, after the Civil War, a lot of the Union soldiers had to remain in the South to protect black people. And part of that was them protecting black people while they were trying to vote. In fact, there was one historic election. How many of y'all know which election that was? It was a close election, which ended up being decided in a hotel room. A deal was made. There was one presidential candidate that was a Republican, and there was one that was a Democrat. And this was the deal that they made. The Republican would be able to become president, but he had to withdraw all of the Union troops from the South. And right after that, you have Jim Crow. How many of y'all remember? Do y'all know? Do y'all know? Darius Drum said, yo, I'm a moderator. Thanks, AM. Okay, so when you black folks, when you get a chance, any of you really, look up the Compromise of 1877. Look up the Compromise of 1877. Also known as the Wormley Agreement, the Bargain of 1877, or the Corrupt Bargain, was an unwritten political deal in the United States to settle the intense dispute over the results of the 1876 presidential election, ending the filibuster of the certified results and the threat of political violence in exchange for the end to federal reconstruction. No written evidence of such a deal exists, and its precise details are a matter of historical debate. But most historians agree that the federal government adopted a policy of leniency towards the South to ensure federal authority, and Republican Rutherford B. Hayes' election as president. The existence of an informal agreement to secure Hayes' political authority, known as the Bargain of 1877, was long accepted as a part of American history. Its supposed terms were reviewed by historian C. Van Woodward in his 1951 book, Reunion and Reaction, The Compromise of 1877 and the End of Reconstruction, which also coined the modern name in an effort to compare the political resolution of the election to the famous Missouri Compromise and Compromise of 1850. Under the Compromise, Democrats controlling the House of Representatives allowed the decision of the Electoral Commission to take effect, securing political legitimacy for Hayes' legal authority as president. The subsequent withdrawal of the last federal troops from the southern United States effectively ended the Reconstruction era and forfeited the Republican claims to the state governments in South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. The outgoing president, Republican Ulysses S. Grant, removed the soldiers from Florida, and as President Hayes removed the remaining troops from South Carolina and Louisiana, as soon as the troops left, many white Republicans also left, and the Redeemer Democrats, who already dominated other state governments in the South, took control, Some black Republicans felt betrayed as they lost their political legitimacy in the South that had been defined by the federal military. And by 1905, most black people were effectively disenfranchised in every southern state. Criticism from other historians have taken various forms, ranging from outright rejection of the compromise theory to criticism of Woodward's emphasis of certain influences of outcomes. But critics concede that the theory became almost universally accepted in the years after Woodward published Reunion and Reaction. So, and I went over this back in 2020. I don't know how many of you were here in 2020, but if you remember, in 2020, you had a very close election. And I told you guys that that particular election was very similar to that particular election. It was between Rutherford B. Hayes and who was the other one? Who was the Democrat? I can't remember the Democrat's name. Now, the reason why it ended Reconstruction is because, let's see, in 1875, it was widely assumed that President Ulysses S. Grant would run for a third term as president, despite the two-term tradition set by the first president, George Washington. Grant's inner circle advised him to go for a third term, and he almost did, but the House passed a resolution declaring that the two-term tradition was to prevent a dictatorship. President Grant ruled himself out of the running in 1876, and Ohio's governor, Rutherford B. Hayes, was the eventual Republican nominee. New York's Governor Samuel Tilden, it was Tilden, was the Democratic nominee. The results of the election remain among the most disputed in U.S. history, without a doubt. Tilden won the popular vote over Hayes by about 250,000 votes. However, in American presidential election, it is the electoral votes that matter most. After the first count, Tilden won 184 electoral votes to Hayes' 165, with 20 electoral votes from 4 states reporting disputed results. Both political parties' electors reported that they were the winners in Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. Now, the reason why the votes were disputed in those 4 states, those were the 4 states in the South. And the reason why there was so much dispute around it is because in the South, you had the red shirts and these other organizations that were engaging in voter intimidation. The only problem was both sides were arguing manipulation, right? So on the Republican side, they were arguing that in the South, there was a lot of voter intimidation going on against the blacks in the South, because during that time, you had the Union soldiers in the South that were basically ushering in Reconstruction, which was, basically coming out of the antebellum South, the antebellum slavery, right? So you had Union soldiers down there making sure that, trying to make sure that, you know, the Southerners did not push the Southern states back into slavery, right? So the Republicans were basically arguing that there was voter intimidation going on. So, they looked at those four states as, oh, well, those four states, you can't say that you won those four states because, there was voter intimidation. Now, on the flip side, the Democrats were basically saying no. Um, there was intimidation on the other side because of the Union soldiers. There was basically a lot of discrepancies. So they were having this argument. And the supposed compromise was Tilden would fall back and allow Hayes to be the winner of this. He agreed to remove the Union soldiers, the Union troops from the South, and let those states in the South go back to governing themselves. And once that happened, you see the emergence of Jim Crow in the South. But like I said, we actually went over this back during the 2020 election. I gave a breakdown of what actually happened, or what was alleged to have happened back then. In Oregon, one elector was replaced after being declared illegal for being an elected or appointed official. The question of who should have been awarded these electoral votes is a source of continued controversy. Congress created an electoral commission in January on January 29th of 1877 to resolve the dispute. It consisted of 15 members, 5 each from the House and the Senate, plus 5 Supreme Court justices. 8 members were Republicans and 7 were Democrats. An informal agreement was struck that became known as the Compromise of 1877. Following this agreement, the commission voted along party lines to award all 20 disputed electoral votes to Hayes, thus assuring his election victory by a margin of 185 to 184. I told you it was a really close election. The Compromise of 1877 was that Southern Democrats would acknowledge Hayes as president, but only on the understanding that Republicans would meet 5 demands. The 5 key points of the compromise was: 1, to remove all remaining military forces from the former Confederate states. At the time, U.S. troops remained in Louisiana, South Carolina, Florida, but the compromise completed their withdrawal from the region. 2, to appoint at least one Southern Democrat to Hayes's cabinet. 3, to construct the construction of another transcontinental railroad through the South and Texas. 4, legislation to help industrialize the South and restore its economy following Reconstruction. And 5, the right to deal with African American citizens in Southern states without Northern interference. And that right there is where you get the black codes and the Jim Crow BS. Hayes was peacefully inaugurated in March of 1877. Points 1 and 2 of the compromise took effect. Hayes had already announced his support for the restoration of home rule, which would involve federal troop removal. But before the election, David M. Key of Tennessee was appointed to Hayes's cabinet. It was not unusual for a president so narrowly elected to select a cabinet member from the other party. Points 3 and 4 were never enacted. It is possible there were no firm agreement about them. Point 5 had already begun in much of the South, but when But when the remaining military forces were removed, African Americans across the South lost many of their rights. White supremacists took control of most governments and enacted laws and policies specifically designed to deny black citizens their rights. And that's why later you get, if I'm not mistaken, the southern states were using a loophole. They were using a loophole in the Bill of Rights. They were using a loophole in the Bill of Rights to deny. They were using a loophole in the Bill of Rights to deny blacks a lot of their rights in the South, which is why they had to come up with the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which protects the rights and liberties of citizens. And now that black people were actually free and citizens of the United States, who was it? What's the name of that lawyer? I can't think of the name of the lawyer. But there's a particular lawyer that actually pointed out the discrepancy in the Bill of Rights that allowed those states to use that loophole to deny blacks their rights in those states, which is why they had to come up with the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which grants citizenship to anyone born or naturalized in the United States. Which, it ensures equal protection. Equal protection ensures that all citizens have equal protection under the law. Due process: no state can take away a person's life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Voting rights: the government can punish states that restrict citizens' right to vote. Public debt: the validity of the public debt is protected, but debts incurred to aid insurrection or rebellion are illegal and void. Disqualification from office: a person who has taken an oath to support the Constitution but has engaged in insurrection or rebellion cannot hold office. See, and that right there, that part right there, that's the reason why they keep on saying that Trump incited an insurrection. That's why they keep saying that. That's the main reason why they keep saying that over and over. Because due to the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, if you incite an insurrection, you actually are disqualified from holding public office. That's the reason why they keep bringing that up. That's why whenever somebody tries to say, oh, what about the Dred Scott case? What about the Dred Scott case? Well, first of all, the Dred Scott case, and a lot of people don't remember this, but the Taney court actually had more Democrats than Republicans. And so when you look at the Dred Scott case, those of you that say, oh, the reason why, look at the Dred Scott case, they said that they didn't have to acknowledge his rights because he was a former slave, so he didn't have any rights that the government was bound to respect, right? Well, go back and look at that case. Go back and look at who voted against it. Go back and look who voted against that ruling and who voted in favor of that ruling. If you go back and look at it, there were 2 Republicans that voted in favor of Dred Scott having his rights, and the rest were Democrats who voted against him having his rights. But it doesn't matter what the decision of the Taney court was, because the 14th Amendment to the Constitution actually nullifies that. So whenever you come and say, "Oh well, the Dred Scott case proves that we're not citizens," no, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. And it certainly doesn't prove that you're not a citizen if your ass was born in America after the 14th Amendment. Because while back then some, despicable lawyer could try to use whatever loophole he could find to say that a former slave doesn't have any rights, that shit doesn't apply to you because you were never a slave. You weren't born a slave. But, Negroes still debate that over and over. They still run around here debating that or whatever. Ooh, we had 900 and some people in here. The moment I started giving this history lesson, look at how many people ran out of here. And then you have the nerve to wonder why black folk, because I know it was black folk that ran out of here, you have the nerve to wonder why black folk are low information voters. That's why. Because they don't know the history. They don't know their history and don't care to know their history. Shout out to AH. They don't care to know their history. Bingham. That's the name of the lawyer. John Bingham. That's the name of the lawyer. John Bingham. That's the name of the lawyer, John Bingham.
There's a story about a white unionist in the South whose support for newly freed blacks angers his neighbors. They come over one night and basically tell him to shut up. When he refuses, they take him outside, tie him to a tree, and horsewhip him. And they tell him if they have to come back again, they're going to hang him from that same tree. But the man had nowhere to turn, because the South at this time was a place of lawless tyranny. The 14th Amendment was designed to stamp out that tyranny by requiring government officials to respect the basic civil rights of all Americans.
The period following the Civil War was marked by shocking abuses of individual rights, and by a constitutional amendment, the 14th Amendment, designed to halt those abuses. The seeds of those events were contained in our founding documents, including the Declaration of Independence.
The Declaration of Independence was a promise of limited government based on individual rights and the ideals of the Enlightenment. And the story of the American Constitution, and especially the 14th Amendment, is really the story of our trying to live up to that promise.
Of course, the lofty ideals in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution cannot be reconciled with the abomination of slavery, the tacit approval of which set us on a path to disaster from day one.
The Constitution's failure to resolve the question of slavery gave rise to a furious national debate. Some people, like Senator John Calhoun, argued that the Constitution's references to slavery amounted to a tacit endorsement. Others, like the radical legal scholar Lysander Spooner, argued exactly the opposite, that the Constitution presumed all men were free, making slavery impossible.
So in public, there were two sides. The anti-slavery camp, arguing that the Constitution presupposed that people were free and that this was totally irreconcilable with the idea of slavery. And you had the pro-slavery camp, arguing almost exactly the opposite. Unfortunately, in the courts, the pro-slavery side won an almost unbroken series of victories.
For example, anti-slavery activists had argued that the Bill of Rights automatically bound the states. But the Supreme Court rejected that position in a case called Barron v. Baltimore, holding that the Bill of Rights only affected the federal government. Later on, in a case called Dred Scott v. Sanford, the court, in an opinion by Chief Justice Roger Taney, not only rejected the anti-slavery position that the Privileges and Immunities Clause in Article 4 protected individual rights, but actually went so far as to hold that the black man had no rights that, quote, the white man was bound to respect. Over the course of the debates about slavery in America, what you really see is a movement that started out as an anti-slavery movement really changed into a movement much more radical and much more broadly devoted to the protection of natural rights, ranging from free speech to the right to control one's own labor. Part of that is due to the influence of intellectuals like Lysander Spooner or Joel Tiffany, but part of that is just a reaction to the horrible abuses of natural rights that abolitionists saw in the pre-war South and immediately after the Civil War.
In the aftermath of the Civil War, newly freed blacks were systematically terrorized, disarmed, and even lynched for asserting their right to equality and individual liberty. The stories of violence perpetrated against newly freed blacks are truly horrifying.
For example, Robert Church, a black entrepreneur in Memphis, Tennessee, actually one of the first major black entrepreneurs anywhere in the Reconstruction South, owned a saloon and several other businesses around Memphis. He was wildly successful, he was beloved by the community, and in 1866, an angry mob of white people, largely led by members of the local police force, broke into his saloon, dragged him into the street, shot him, and left him for dead, all because he was in a business they thought a black man shouldn't be in.
By the time Congress convened in 1866, anti-slavery Republicans dominated both houses. Led by men like John Bingham in the House, along with Senators Charles Sumner and...
Hold on, let me rewind that back for all of you in the back that aren't good at hearing, right? All of you in the back that aren't good at hearing, right? What did it just say? What did it just say?
Congress convened in 1866. Anti-slavery Republicans dominated both houses.
When Congress reconvened in 1866, it was dominated by anti-slavery Republicans. Republicans. I don't want to have to teach y'all this every 4 years. I won't have to teach this every 4 years.
By the time Congress convened in 1866, anti-slavery Republicans dominated both houses. Led by men like John Bingham in the House, along with Senators Charles Sumner and Jacob Howard, radical Republicans enjoyed complete control of Congress.
They have the power to amend the Constitution.
There's that word, radical Republicans. What did I say when I read the plan for the red shirts? They referred to Republicans as radical.
And they are determined to use it. They were faced with an unending series of abuses.
See, what you don't realize, to all you folks that want to vote Democrat, this is what you don't realize. Abraham Lincoln, if I'm not mistaken, the first Republican president, was considered a radical. In fact, here's a little Easter egg for you. Go watch the movie Gangs of New York. You remember the butcher that was the head of that one gang? Go back and watch. There's one scene where he's walking through the streets and he sees a poster of Abraham Lincoln. He pulls out his knife and throws it and hits the poster of Abraham Lincoln in the forehead. How many of y'all remember that scene? So you got Abraham Lincoln, the first Republican president, considered a radical, right? And this is what you don't realize. Ever since the Emancipation Proclamation, the Democrats have been fighting like hell to put you back in slavery. That's why whenever somebody says, "Oh, if Trump gets elected, he's going to put black people back in slavery." That's why it's one of the most ridiculous statements anyone could ever say.
In the Reconstruction South, state and local governments had responded to the new 13th Amendment ban on slavery by trying to deprive newly freed slaves and their white supporters of any meaningful freedom, especially economic freedom. Economic liberty, the right to pursue a livelihood of your own choosing and to keep the money you earn, was the opposite of slavery and the real opportunity for freed slaves to lead a free life. The pro-slavery forces knew this. So in the South, freed slaves weren't just banned from pursuing particular occupations, but in some places it was actually illegal for black people to leave their employer's property without written permission. In others, breaking a labor contract was punished by whipping. The 14th Amendment was supposed to stop rights violations like these.
One of the rights most frequently mentioned in connection with the 14th Amendment was the right to keep and bear arms. Congress was well aware of the fact that newly freed blacks and white Union soldiers were being systematically disarmed throughout the South.
Wait a minute. So back then, newly freed blacks were being systematically disarmed in the South. Which party today is the party that's fighting for gun control? Refresh my memory. Which party today is the party that's fighting for gun control? Yeah, see, ain't nothing new under the sun. Ain't nothing new under the sun. See, to the black folk that think you're supposed to always vote Democrat, if you actually knew the history of this country, there is no way on God's green earth you would be a Democrat. Absolutely no way.
In order to subjugate and terrorize them. For example, Congress heard testimony about a town in Kentucky where the town marshal was, quote, very prompt to take arms away from all of the returning black soldiers and to shoot them whenever the opportunity arose.
The 14th Amendment was proposed in response to this wholesale violation of civil rights, as embodied, for example, in the notorious Black Codes. The architect of the 14th Amendment, John Bingham, was a learned and well-respected lawyer from Ohio.
Bingham actually appears to have been one of the few members of Congress who understood that by virtue of the Supreme Court's decision in Barron v. Baltimore, the Bill of Rights did not apply directly against the states. In fact, Bingham had to bring a copy of Barron onto the floor of the House to prove that the Bill of Rights had no effect against the states.
John Bingham believed there was a hole in the...
My bad. So I misspoke. There was a Supreme Court decision that basically created a loophole where the Bill of Rights didn't apply to the southern states. And John Bingham, a white man and Republican, figured out this loophole and fixed it.
In fact, Bingham had to bring a copy of Barron onto the floor of the House to prove that the Bill of Rights had no effect against the states.
John Bingham believed there was a hole in the original Constitution, which was that it didn't give the federal government the power to protect individual rights from interference by the states. The 14th Amendment was Bingham's effort to fix that.
The 14th Amendment protects three distinct interests: due process, equal protection, and the privileges or immunities, meaning rights, of United States citizens. Of those three, privileges or immunities are by far the most important because that clause protects individual rights from government infringement. In 1872, the Supreme Court had its first opportunity to interpret the Privileges or Immunities Clause in a case called Slaughterhouse.
And this is where the BS comes in.
Handed down in 1873, the Slaughterhouse cases essentially read the Privileges or Immunities Clause out of the 14th Amendment.
In the Slaughterhouse cases, Justice Samuel Miller, writing for a bare majority of the court, held that the Privileges or Immunities Clause protected only a limited and relatively trivial set of so-called rights of national citizenship, such as the right to access navigable waterways and federal sub-treasuries, and to invoke the protection of the federal government when on the high seas.
This was an utterly absurd reading of the Privileges or Immunities Clause. No one thinks we fought a civil war and amended the Constitution because someone somewhere had difficulty accessing a sub-treasury. And no one thinks that today. There is virtually unanimous agreement among constitutional scholars that the Slaughterhouse majority's interpretation of the Privileges or Immunities Clause is completely indefensible.
Taking their cue from the Supreme Court's refusal to enforce the 14th Amendment consistent with its text, purpose, and history, the states responded by expanding the existing black codes into the formal caste system of Jim Crow. Blacks and whites alike were subject to a host of regulations designed to prevent newly freed blacks, or freedmen as they were called, from becoming economically self-sufficient members of society.
And that's the reason why you had to have the civil rights movement. Not because they didn't try to fix the issue with the 14th Amendment, but because once they fixed the issue with the 14th Amendment, you had a justice try to interpret the 14th Amendment in a way that it wouldn't benefit black people. So you then had the South coming with Jim Crow and all of this BS, and that was the reason why you had to have the Civil Rights era, and the reason why you had to have the Voters' Rights Act of 1965 and all of these other things, you know.
This unrelenting assault on liberty finally forced the Supreme Court to reconsider its understanding of the 14th Amendment.
Having effectively eliminated the Privileges or Immunities Clause as a meaningful part of the Constitution, the court eventually began protecting individual rights through a doctrine called substantive due process. That has a historical pedigree that dates back to the Magna Carta, but the Supreme Court's use of substantive due process to do a job for which the Privileges or Immunities Clause was designed has resulted in a patchwork and incomplete jurisprudence of liberty.
Now, that's what black people should be fighting for. Closing that discrepancy, that loophole. But you never hear black people talking about this. You never hear black people talking about this, ever. You never hear them talk about it. You never hear you never hear none of them talking about substantive due process. You never hear them speak about it. That's why I don't take Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson, the black congressional caucus, the NAACP. This is why I don't take any of them seriously. I don't take any of them seriously because I've never heard them bring up substantive due process. I've never heard them bring it up.
Historical pedigree that dates back to the Magna Carta, but the Supreme Court's use of substantive due process to do a job for which the Privileges or Immunities Clause was designed has resulted in a patchwork and incomplete jurisprudence of liberty. Some rights the 14th Amendment was supposed to protect, like freedom of speech, ended up protected anyway. But others, like economic liberty or the right to own a gun, just got ignored and waved away.
On any fair reading, there is not the slightest doubt that the 14th Amendment protects an individual right to own a gun for self-defense. So why did it take the Supreme Court nearly 150 years to recognize that right, and then by a margin of only one vote? The Second Amendment says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Despite that clear language, it took a carefully planned public interest lawsuit, which I helped design and litigate, District of Columbia v. Heller, to finally persuade the Supreme Court to interpret the Second Amendment as protecting an individual right to own a gun. But because the District of Columbia is a federal jurisdiction to which the Bill of Rights applies directly, Heller left open the question of whether the 14th Amendment protects the right to own a gun from interference by state and local officials, and if so, how? That was the question the Supreme Court took up 2 years later in McDonald versus City of Chicago.
Faced with this question in McDonald, the Supreme Court split into three camps. 4 of the justices wanted to use the traditional substantive due process method to find that the right to keep and bear arms was fundamental and should therefore be applied against the states. Another group of 4 justices wanted to use substantive due process to say that the right to keep and bear arms was not fundamental and therefore shouldn't apply. The deciding 5th vote fell to Justice Clarence Thomas.
Justice Thomas makes such a powerful case for the Privileges or Immunities Clause in his McDonald concurrence that none of the other justices, in the plurality or the dissent, challenge his reading of the relevant history or his conclusion that the right to own a gun is a privilege or immunity of American citizenship.
Translation: if it wasn't for Clarence Thomas, you would have lost your Second Amendment right. And you almost didn't even get him as a Supreme Court justice to be that deciding vote because of Joe Biden, a president who is currently fighting like hell to take away your Second Amendment right. And he just happens to be a Democrat. See how crystal clear that is? Do you see how crystal clear the picture is? Is there anyone in here that is confused by any of this?
The 14th Amendment, and especially the Privileges or Immunities Clause, was a really radical change to the Constitution. It was supposed to give the federal government, and especially the federal courts, the power to protect rights that had been historically trampled by state and local governments. One of these fundamental rights was the right to earn an honest living. But for its entire existence, the Privileges or Immunities Clause has been a dead letter. McDonald starts to change that.
In the wake of McDonald, the Privileges or Immunities Clause is relevant, is alive, in ways it simply hasn't been since it was adopted. And in coming years, as law students sit down to read the different opinions in McDonald, it's going to become clear that only one of those opinions really tries to grapple with the constitutional history, really tries to grapple with the role the 14th Amendment plays in our constitutional structure. And that's going to make an enormous difference.
The 14th Amendment was a promise. It was a promise to the people of this country of limited government and respect for individual rights. But that promise was broken almost immediately by the Supreme Court's redaction of the Privileges or Immunities Clause from the 14th Amendment. The Institute for Justice has been working for 20 years to restore the Privileges or Immunities Clause, to restore the concept of individual liberty to its proper place in the Constitution and its proper place in our society.
Now, here's the other thing that black folk, you should get from this, right? And by the way, to white folk also, this is important to you as well, because as long as they play games like that with the amendments and the Constitution, it can be used against you as well. Make no mistake about it. The fight for black liberty is the fight for American liberty. Period. Point blank, period. And the reason why I don't co-sign black folk that despise America and the Constitution is because I understand that humans are flawed. And I understand that the 3/4 of a human being, or the 3/5 of a human being, or whatever it is in the Constitution, was a mistake. It was a mistake. The question of slavery in the Constitution is the one flaw in an immaculate document. It is the document that has given our country the ability to be one of the greatest countries in this world. You can say what you want to say, but I would not want to live anywhere else. And the reason why I do not view America the way a lot of these pseudo pro-blacks do is because ever since that mistake was made in the Constitution, this country has been fighting tooth and nail to fix that mistake. That cannot be ignored. If you know American history, you know there were a lot of people fighting to change that mistake. And what black folk need to understand is you cannot get rights, privileges, or any of those things in America by begging for them, by marching for them. You have to win those battles in court. You have to win those battles legally. But you can't win those battles legally if you do not understand the law, if you do not understand the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights. If you do not understand the way this country operates, you cannot win at the game. Period. Point blank, period. The privileges and immunity clause was being tampered with because if that particular part of the 14th Amendment is read correctly, you feel me? Because then you go into this area of the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law, right? But if the privileges and immunities of the 14th Amendment are read properly and acknowledged, this business of Dred Scott, it's null and void. It's null and void. But that's the reason why you have some pseudo pro-blacks that will argue Dred Scott because of that particular discrepancy. And I get it. I get it. You feel what I'm saying? But if a black person should find themselves in a situation where their rights are being infringed upon, the only way to do it is to, you know what's crazy? What's crazy is in this day and age, if a black person feels like their rights were violated, they'll complain about it. Back in the day after the Emancipation Proclamation, when black people were free and their rights were being violated, you know what they did? They sued. So even back then, black people understood that if they wanted to win a battle when it came to their rights, and the things they're supposed to be guaranteed by the Constitution, they understood they had to fight that battle in court. That's what Dred Scott did. And he's just one. It's kind of like the whole thing with Rosa Parks. You know, there's always one that stands out, and when we discuss that, we think that it's just one person. There were numerous black people that actually sued and won when it came to fighting for their rights. But make no mistake about it, you cannot ignore what's going on in this day and age where the Democrats are using black celebrities to try to manipulate you and coerce you into voting against your interest. Because there's two things that the Democrats are fighting for like crazy right now. They're fighting for the Planned Parenthood thing, which, if you know anything about Margaret Sanger, she created all of that for the purpose of eliminating black people. And they're also fighting for gun control, which is basically boils down to the rights to be able to take away your guns. And those are two things that no black person should be in favor of. And the reason why is because Margaret Sanger created that freaking program for the purpose of eliminating what she called human weeds. And you damn sure don't want them taking your guns away. So I don't see how any black person that is intelligent and understands the history of this country would be in favor of the Democrats. Because their agenda hasn't changed. It's the same agenda. Going all the way back to Dred Scott. It's the same agenda. Going all the way back to Reconstruction. It's the same agenda. It has not changed. It hasn't changed. The only thing that has changed is that it is now expanded to include not only black people, but American citizens as a whole. But with that being said, I've been up here running my mouth long enough. Hopefully, we learned something. Shout out to Chris. Appreciate you, Chris. Shout out to Dark Power. Shout out to Edgar. He said appreciate the show. You know what's hilarious? There are times where I go on to panels and politics come up. And somebody will say to me, "You don't know anything about politics, Angryman. You don't know shit." And I'll be like, well, I tell you what, come over to my channel. Let's have a debate about politics. Ironically, no one ever shows up. Ironically, no one ever shows up. Don't you find that interesting? Don't you find it interesting that nobody ever shows up? But anyway, you know, people are going to stop underestimating me. But anyway, if you have not checked out my book, The Angryman Standard, go over to Amazon and type The Angryman Standard in the search bar and it will come up. It's available in paperback and hardcover. Or you can hit the link down in the description. If you want to check out some of my merchandise, some of the BINO Nation merchandise, all you have to do is go to shop.binonation.com. Again, that is shop.binonation.com. But other than that, I appreciate every last one of you guys for tuning in. Appreciate all of the sponsors of the show, everybody that contributed, and everybody that hit the like button. But more importantly, I appreciate the BINO Nation. Salute to every last one of you guys. And I will holler at you later. Peace.
Spartans! What is your profession?